Hi, my name is Dr. Susan Swim. I am Executive Director of Now I See a Person Institute, and this is part of our Lived Experiences series where we're talking with people about their interest and participation in the mental health field that's going on at this point in time. And we're lucky to have Mr. Jim Gottstein coming. I don't know if I pronounced that right or not.
Gottstein, we say it wrong. Gottstein.
and you're author of the Zyprexa Papers, which is regarding a famous case with Eli Lilly, and you're a lawyer. You have wear many hats in promoting wellness within the mental health treatment, and I would love to be able to talk with you about some of the things that you feel that are passionate for people to um, be aware of right now in our mental health treatment. We were talking a little bit previously about maybe some of the subject matter, and I guess some of the things that I just feel personally are important are that people are aware of some of the consequences of seeking treatment in this day and age. And this has actually been going on for a long period of time, but I know myself, I've just been talking about this the last couple of years. And often it's a time that, when people are at their worst periods of functioning, of suffering, of relationships, that they go into therapeutic treatment to help resolve that and actually leave with some very significant consequences instead of success. And so um, maybe you could take over for me and describe a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I got into this because I was really lucky not to have been made permanently mentally ill by the system. I had some trouble and ended up in the hospital. This was in 1982. And I was told I would never get better. I'd have to take these debilitating drugs for the rest of my life. Um, and I was just lucky that that didn't happen to me. So as a lawyer, I founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, PsychRights, whose mission is to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock. And I did that after reading Bob Whitaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic, no, Mad in America, his first book, which to me was it's a great read, but to me it was also a litigation roadmap for how to attack forced drugging on the basis that it's not in people's best interests, as well as the civil rights aspects of it. And so I did that in 2002 and been working on it ever since. And then about a year and a half ago, with some really prominent people, we wrote this report on improving mental health outcomes, and and it was really kind of the culmination of what I've learned, over these 25 years or more, and basically the situation is that this over reliance, it's kind of this ubiquitous insistence on the drugs, whether people want them or not, uh, is reducing the recovery rate of people diagnosed with serious mental illness from a possible 80% to 5%. Okay. And, um, and reducing people's lifespans by 20 to 25 years on average. So, and the fact that there's not an uproar over this just shows how little society cares about this group of people, for various reasons. But it just is not necessary because, as you've shown it with your work in Now I See a Person, most of these people, 80% can really get through what they're going through and get on with their lives. Um, so, and another thing about the current mental health system is that people, they say people get psychiatrically incarcerated if they're, quote, mentally ill and a danger to themselves or others. Well, and the danger to themselves is basically suicide. But suicides go up astronomically after people, for people who've been locked up. So that's actually is a ludicrous reason for locking people up. And the idea that psychiatrists or anybody else can predict who's going to be violent just isn't borne out by the facts. And my estimate is that no more than 10% of people that get psychiatrically incarcerated actually meet that legal criteria. And no one can legitimately be drugged against their will because you have to prove it's in the person's best interest and there's no less intrusive alternatives, neither of which is basically ever true. And so there are all these other approaches that work besides the drugs. Like I said, you've had your very successful, now I see a person program, which is, that's kind of, it's consistent with all these approaches that work. There's this approach that was developed in part of Lapland in Finland called open dialogue. And they consider the problems basically being kind of the spaces between people rather than the person themselves. And they have these two-person teams. They'll respond within 24 hours. The team stays the same. They work with the person's whole system, because again, they don't consider the problem the person, it's like what's going on. And they actually eliminated schizophrenia in that part of Lapland because in order to get that diagnosis, you have to have those symptoms for 6 months, and they were getting people through it before then. And then there's peer respites, especially in the United States and other places too, that are run by people who have gone through the system, and they're basically what they sound like, respites. People can come in and there's no force. People can take the drugs or not take the drugs. Usually they have limited stays, 7 to 10 days. And then there's a program called Soteria, which was a study by, and I learned that in Mad in America, a study in the 1970s by Loren Mosher and Alma Men. Loren Mosher was the chief of schizophrenia research at the National Institute of Mental Health. And he set up this house, and it was a study. So people were randomly assigned, they would be brought into the psychiatric emergency situation, randomly assigned to, hospital as normal or Soteria house. And Soteria house, it was this house, and there would be like around 6 residents, and there'd be 2 staff people at all the times. By the way, there's a great new book about this called Seeking Soteria by Eugene Larkin. It's marvelous. He was a staff member there, and,
Oh, wow.
and you can see why he's just a fabulous human being, and why he was so helpful to people. And but they basically had an 80% at the end of 5 years, 80% weren't on drugs, and were working or in school, which is basically the same statistics that open dialogue had, which is why I said you get to 80% possible recovery rate. And one of the interesting things is that there's a study done by Martin Harrow and Joe, I forget his first name, but they did this long-term naturalistic study, and they found that people who who stayed on the drugs had a 5% recovery rate. That's where I get the 5%. And if people got off the drugs, they had a 40% recovery rate, which is, 8 times better than 5%, but half of 80%. And what that really shows is how important it is to try and avoid putting people on these drugs, the neuroleptics, which are marketed as antipsychotics, even though they don't have antipsychotic properties for most. And instead of, and there are, a bunch of different approaches, ECPR, emotional CPR, and there's these healing homes and all these different similar approaches, which really recognize that these are people going through things, and they maybe could use some help getting through things, but there's nothing really different about them, and they should be treated with respect. One of the things about the peer system is that there's no hierarchy if it's done properly, and one of the problems is the whole peer supporter situation has been co-opted and corrupted by the system. I mean, it's interesting, you've got something that's really been shown to work, which the peer support, which is no hierarchy, mutual support, and so then the mental health system comes in and says, oh, we've got to do, we're going to do peer support too. And now they've got peer supporters who are tasked with medication compliance, forcing people to take their drugs. So the drugs that are prescribed, which are so harmful for them. I mean, I could go on forever. So for example, one of the things that happens in these court hearings, which is proceedings, which is, kind of my life's work, that's been my main focus, is if someone says that these, drugs are harmful and they don't help, then that's proof that they're mentally ill. And, so it's just this horrific system. And for the life of me, I can't, figure out how to, I've been trying to get this message out for a long time, and it's been pretty hard to really break through.
And that's one of the things that I'm just trying to do in a small format, is to bring awareness to people, because I think most people on the street, if they're, and I'm so glad that you talked about Yako's work and some of the other people's work, because I think something that's very common in all of this is that it's not seen as something that's just a biochemical reaction that happens to you, and then there's this course of action that has to be developed that's going to keep someone to be a patient for life. That there's an expectancy that recovery or reclaiming your life is something that's a certainty, just something that is kind of like maybe even some pipe dream. Because as it is now, if you were to go out on the street and ask 5 people what would happen if you came home tonight and your loved one seemed to be having some psychotic features, the first thing that they're going to do is that they're going to take them to the emergency room. They're going to call the family doctor. They're going to do something that's going to create them entering into this space of their self-identity is going to be rapidly changed, that maybe an hour before they were a functioning person, and the next hour they're going to have some type of diagnostic criteria that puts them into this box that they're incapable. And, I don't think that in 1982, this was such a huge issue, but today it is. And people rapidly find themselves in situations where if they have, especially in California, if they have a diagnosis, they can be hospitalized for up to 2 years. If they do not take the medications, they will find them, or they do not follow the treatment plans, they will be hospitalized. And some people have been saying that this is against due process. You have a lot of civil rights experts involved in this right now. Is this something that you've heard very much about, Jim?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, there's this whole federal system, which, because of the uncertainty of the budget situation, who knows, where it's going to end up. But it's called Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Act. And the purpose of one of the two purposes of the act is to ensure that the rights of individuals with mental illness are protected. And in order to do that, there's this advisory council, and there's a protection advocacy or P&A agency in every state. But they do the P&As have a lot of different things that they do, and they've never really embraced the mental illness aspect of it. And I'm using mental illness because that's in the in the statute. But the people that were promoting this, first they didn't want the P&As to do it because they didn't think they, really would embrace it. But they couldn't get that through. But they got these advisory councils who are to jointly determine the annual priorities and policies under their PANI Act funding, and 60% of the members of these councils have to be people with lived experience, of the mental illness system, and they've basically been squashed by the P&As, and so I developed this PANI Advisory Council Empowerment Project, where we're trying to recruit people to get on them, and then work with them to make enforcing people's rights not to be psychiatrically imprisoned or drugged or electroshocked against their will a high priority of their protection and advocacy agency, which to me, it's obvious this should be a high priority, probably the highest priority, because you've got this system that is reducing the recovery rate from a possible 80% to 5%, and literally killing people. I mean, people live on death row longer than they do, on these drugs. And this is happening because to a huge number of people through violations of their rights. And that's what the protection and advocacy agencies should be pursuing, in my mind. And of course, there are all these other people that take the drugs after being lied to about them by the prescribers. So, and it's not just the neuroleptics.
Right. But can you talk about that a little bit? Actually, I was talking with someone about that earlier this morning.
Well, there's this idea of informed consent, which if you don't consent to a drug being put in your body, that's battery. That's literally a battery, assault and battery. And so and the consent is supposed to be, quote, informed, which means you should be told about the potential benefits and the potential harms. And the potential benefits of most of these drugs are really very minimal at best. So, and the studies that get cooked up to support them, are basically fraudulent. Like, so I write about in my book, the Zyprexa Papers, about the studies that led to the approval of Zyprexa, the chemical name is olanzapine. And one of the things they did was the control group or the placebo group were people that they abruptly withdrew from Haldol. Well, people that get abruptly withdrawn from Haldol often have, as a result of the withdrawal, they become psychotic, or their symptoms, really, they get symptoms. And it's not because of any underlying mental illness. It's because these drugs have changed the structure of the brain. So what they do is they block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in the frontal lobes, basal ganglia, and the limbic system. So before I knew about this, I thought of them as chemical straitjackets. But now I know that actually they're chemical lobotomies because they block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in the frontal lobe. So, but what happens in the brain is for a few weeks it pumps out more dopamine to try and compensate for this blockage, and then it gives up, or the response, because it's continuing, is it grows more dopamine receptors to try and get more dopamine going through. And so while they've never found any brain abnormalities in people diagnosed with schizophrenia before the drugs, once they introduce the drugs, find all kinds of abnormalities, including these increased dopamine receptors and actually shrinkage of, I forget what exactly, part of its brain shrinks, part of it gets bigger. And nobody's told this. And then when they have these symptoms, they said, see, you need the drugs. Well, anyway, so I started this tirade with this study. And so the placebo group, supposed placebo group, were people abruptly withdrawn from Haldol to make their symptoms, more pronounced. And that's supposedly the comparison group. Except some of the people actually do quite well even when they're abruptly withdrawn from Haldol. And so they were thrown out of the study, and it's called placebo washout. So that's one of the ways that they cook the books on these studies. I could go on. The other big thing, olanzapine, was that the drug makes people feel so terrible that like 70% of the people dropped out of the studies. And so what they did is they said, oh, well, we'll just consider that whatever their situation was when they dropped out, that's what it would have been at the end of this 12-week study. Well, what's the point of doing a study if you do that? And they call that LOCF, last observation carried forward. And that was the basis, these were studies that formed the basis for Zyprexa getting approved. So very little benefit. And even in those studies, I did a case, as Faith Meyer's case, and I had this expert witness, Dr. Grace Jackson, who did a study of this. And she wrote this report called Olanzapine, Dangerous Drug, Dubious Efficacy. And she noted that there was a signal for it causing diabetes. And that's what the, kind of how the Zyprexa Papers got started, is I got called from an expert witness who wanted to subpoena me, who wanted me to subpoena him for documents that Eli Lilly hid showing that Zyprexa caused diabetes and other metabolic problems, and they were illegally marketing it to elderly and children. So, so that's Zyprexa, and there's an unbelievable number of people, like I don't know, 20% or something, of the on the SSRI, so-called antidepressants, and they have just basically no clinical benefit and big harms, including up to half the people get sexual dysfunction, and a lot of it's permanent. It's called PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. Um, and people have committed suicide over that. And so it's such a, terrible situation. It's kind of hard to even believe it could be as bad as this is, but I think that's kind of what your experience has been, hasn't it?
One of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking is that most people really don't know what you're talking about. That they have I don't even think that most practitioners have any idea what you're talking about. That they're not informed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, that's what happened with Dr. Grace Jackson. And she was in the Navy, and she was at the hospital at Bethesda. And she was doing what she was taught, what she was told, and she observed that what she was doing wasn't helping her patients. And so she started researching and found out the truth. And so she refused to continue doing it. And she was drummed out of the Navy. They went after her license to practice. She ended up going bankrupt, as I recall. That's what happens to a lot of people, a lot of people in the system, that they start to try and do the right thing. Um, so, but there's this guy, Bruce Levine. He's a fabulous psychologist in what's maybe Cleveland, or since, I don't know, in Ohio. Um, and he makes the point that you have to be pretty obedient to become an MD, because you just have to do what they say. And so, as a general rule, medical doctors are not, don't go against the system. They're pretty compliant.
So now I was just thinking about what people are told today, that they have this disease entity within them, that they're going to have to be suspect to themselves for the rest of their lives, that they're going to have to keep themselves in check. All when, like, maybe on Friday, they were maybe suffering, but they hadn't yet received treatment. And then on Monday, they received treatment. They're given a new identity that they have to kind of live in fear of their own mind. And, I think all of those different, open dialogue and some of the other methodologies you described, of course, has a different perspective on that the pathology is not inside the person, and that the maybe the road to freedom or the road to change is not just inside the person as well, but the system requires some adjustments. And all the people that we work with, we always work with the entire family if possible. So it's not that we decide who's important to work with, but who they feel is important to be their support systems while they are reclaiming their lives, and whether they're going off medications or they're finding ways to make peace with the type of treatment that they've had in the past. I was just talking to a woman this morning that was talking about how difficult it is for her, knowing that um, that she became worse,
That she can
that
what?
became worse with treatment.
Oh,
Her symptoms worsened, and
huh.
that when she was put on the SSRIs and some other types of medications, that her the reason that she sought treatment is that she was having some anxiety. And then after this, she started having panic attacks. And then she started having, possibly some other types of episodes, and was very distraught. But the more that she tried to reach out to her psychiatrist and her psychologist to help them understand what was going on with her, and this is a person that was a licensed clinician also. So she had, probably seen people in her quote unquote state of mind, but she couldn't convince anybody. Her voice had no value. That once that she calls it, once her box was checked, that she had no options, and she still continued down that road, just trying because she wasn't certain if maybe she was right or she was wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's another great new book, Unshrunk by Laura Delano, and that's her story, pretty extreme. When she was 13, she had 13-year-old angst and got psychiatrized, and and it got worse and worse and worse until finally, actually, she read the 2010 book by Robert Whitaker. She saw the cover and it really resonated with her, and so she managed to get off the drugs. It's quite a compelling story too. So it's once people get that label, nothing they say is credited. I mean, the idea is that it's the product of misfiring neurons, or this damaged brain, and there's no evidence that what gets diagnosed as mental illness has anything to do with an abnormal brain or something wrong with the brain. And my experience is, when I talk to people, they pretty uniformly feel that things went on in their childhood that set them up for trouble, and then something in the recent past pushed them over the edge. Um, and I mean, one of the things I think that to me that kind of describes maybe the process is that my view of is that this is really at adaptations that people make to deal with untenable situations. And so, for example, it's pretty consistent, although I always forget what the age is, but when young children are physically abused, including sexually abused, that one of the ways that they cope with that is they kind of withdraw to a part of their mind and withdraw, and so that abuse is happening to someone else. It's not them, and that's a really quite striking response, an effective response to this terrible thing that's happening to them. But then they get this mode where in different situations they have different personalities that they get, and people, the common term is multiple personalities, and the diagnostic term is dissociative identity disorder. And when people have all these different alters, they're called, and the alters don't know what each other are doing, of course, it's a pretty chaotic life. But it's an example of the kind of process that people go through to deal with these untenable situations in their life. I mean, there's this great book uh, called How to Become a Schizophrenic by John Modrow, and he writes about, how he was, basically made schizophrenic by what was what was going on in his life and how he was being treated.
I was thinking back to the narratives that used to be before these narratives of disease and biology and broken brains or whatsoever. And, you know, I love that you named the work of Laura and some other uh, heroes, right? That are um, trying to prevent this from happening to other people, or at least making people aware. So let me just ask you a few questions about the Zyprexa papers, and then maybe we can wrap this up and be able to revisit this. But can you tell us a little bit about your book and how this would be helpful to what we're talking about right now?
Well, so as I mentioned, I got this call out of the blue from this expert witness, Dr. David Eagleman, and it was in late November 2006, and there was a secrecy order that said he couldn't disclose this information he knew, but if he was subpoenaed from another case, he had to give Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Zyprexa, notice and a reasonable opportunity to object before he turned over the documents. And he read this paper by Grace Jackson. It was posted on the internet, and thought maybe I would do it, and I was very interested in doing it. And so, but you can't just subpoena someone, you've got to have a case. And so I went looking for a case which was a whole drama in itself. And I got accused of ambulance chasing, and I was banned from the hospital, but I eventually, it didn't take that long, found this guy, Bill Bigley, whose life was just destroyed by psychiatry. And I really related to him because he was just a couple months older than me, and he had been hospitalized a couple of years before me. And the psychiatrist in that first hospitalization was the same one who saved my life and told me, well, you just need to learn how to deal with, not getting sleep. Anybody who doesn't get sleep will, go psychotic. I like the word crazy. But anyway, and he said of Bill, when he was discharged, that, Bill had been successful. He was a native. He was a tiny guy, and but he was a heavy equipment operator with a wife and two children. And his wife left him, took the daughters. He was saddled with alimony and child support payments he couldn't deal with, and he had, would colloquially be called a nervous breakdown, and he ended up in the hospital. And he was pleasant and cooperative. They gave him the drugs. Trying to think, it was probably Haldol. Oh yeah, and they pounded him with Haldol. At the time, they considered it a neuroleptic. You knew you had reached a neuroleptic dose when you had introduced these involuntary movements called extrapyramidal symptoms. So his brain was just pounded with these drugs right in the beginning. But when he was discharged, Dr. Alberts, who was a psychiatrist, said that his prognosis was guarded depending on how much help he was given with dealing with, his divorce and the, child support payments and stuff and alimony, which he was given none. So then, he was out, and then he came, he wasn't given any help. He came back, and he decided he wasn't that these drugs weren't helping him. So he started to try and refuse. And so then they started forcing him. And so this was like in the 80s, and fast forward to 2006 when I met him, he'd had over 70 hospitalizations, was under this guardianship. Um, and so about half the book is about that, and then the other half, well, about that and my representation of him, um, which I think is really interesting. And there are lots of levels in the book, but one of them is how I went about conducting these cases. And I view these as high stakes cases. I mean, I mentioned previously that people live on death row longer than they do on these drugs, which, maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but not a lot. So, but anyway, so part of the book is, one of the kind of levels of it is how I go about these cases, and I think of them as high stakes cases, which the system doesn't. I mean, they're practically ministerial acts when people want to lock someone up and drug them. Lots of times these hearings last even just 2 minutes sometimes, and maybe on average 5 minutes. So it's ludicrous that these are legitimate legal proceedings. So, but that's not true when I did these cases. They were all out legal battles. But then when Lilly didn't respond fast enough, I got the documents out. Eagleman was working with the New York Times. There was a series of front page New York Times articles starting in mid-December of 2006. And Lilly got, let us say, peeved. And so they went after me. They threatened me with criminal contempt and to go after my license to practice law. And a month after that article, I lived in Alaska at the time and was in the United States District Court in Brooklyn in front of Judge Jack Weinstein, who's a kind of a legend. Anyway, so who ultimately decided that I had conspired to steal these documents. So about half the book's about that, and I like to think that I explain the legal proceedings in a pretty understandable way. Another level of the book is there are a number of psychiatric survivors. Those are people who got caught up in this psychiatric force and escaped and went on to become, really, I mean, they already were amazing people, but to really do amazing things. I mean, we talked earlier about Ron Bassman, who wrote this book, A Fight to Be, and he was diagnosed as a hopeless, schizophrenic in his teens, and he ended up with PhD in psychology, and he ran a community mental health center, and there are a number of people in the book that got involved, and I do a little paragraph or two on each one of them, and I'm trying to subtly suggest that it's just not true that people diagnosed with this, even schizophrenia, don't recover. But through the examples of all these people. So one was Ted Chabazinski, who in the 30s, his mother was in the psych hospital, and he grew up there, and they experimented electroshock on him as a little boy. And that was part of the experiments to, authorize electroshock in children. And he, he got out at 18, graduated college, graduated law school, became a lawyer, became an advocate. So that's another theme in the book, is that people actually do get better.
And I really think that that is probably the most important thing for people to know. I know we had talked earlier about this, and we'll go ahead and wrap up, but you had spoken about hope, that when people have hope, then that the prognosis is very favorable.
Well, it's, I think, hope and having someone believe in you are the two most important things. And denying that you're mentally ill is also very helpful, although that's, cited as proof that you are mentally ill and is denying it. But the system basically has a sign at the entrance, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And it's just such a terrible message and incorrect.
Hopefully, more people will learn about this through your expertise. Not only have you written a book, but being on these boards and connecting with so many people that are trying to do similar things to raise awareness. You really are a true hero, Jim.
Thank you.
You
You're
shape
very kind.
you being with me today.
My pleasure. I don't see the red